We are live.
We are live. Welcome to our coalition's very first Facebook Live event. So to kick things off while everyone is getting online, let's introduce ourselves and share a little bit about each organization. So let's start with Cindy.
Okay. I'm Cindy Russell. I'm the Executive Director of the Reading Center. We are located in Rochester, Minnesota, and the mission of our organization is to serve the needs of people with dyslexia. And we do that through testing, tutoring, and training.
Yep, and I'm John Alexander. I'm a literacy consultant for Groves Academy. Had been the executive director for 2 years and then the head of school for 12 years. We at Groves work as a school for kids with dyslexia, and we have a learning center that conducts assessments and tutoring, and speech and language services, and runs a summer school. And then we have an Institute for Professional Learning, which partners with charter, public, and independent schools in bringing our literacy framework into the schools. So I'm representing Groves in that way.
Okay. I'm Rachel Berger. I'm the Executive Director of Decoding Dyslexia Minnesota. Our mission is to educate, advocate, and to empower all around the area of dyslexia. We are a grassroots movement nationally, but our local chapter here is made up of parents, educators, and professionals who are concerned about the limited access to interventions specific to dyslexia within their educational environments. And so we educate, advocate, and empower in several different ways. We work on policy. We also have advocacy awareness events where parents and others can learn to advocate for their student and how best to do that, and empower parents how best to support their students. Anyway.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And I am Sarah Carlson-Wallrath. You can't see me, I'm just off to the side. But I'm a board member with the International Dyslexia Association Upper Midwest branch. And this branch of IDA was formed, I just looked this up today, in September of 1969, so 50 years ago already. It includes Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. So the branch hosts an annual conference in the spring and webinars throughout the year on topics related to dyslexia and structured literacy. So you can contact the branch for referrals to tutors and testers, and very much has a very large library of recorded webinars, including one on this topic that was just recorded last week. So feel free to go to the website and check that out. All of these organizations are linked in the bio that of this Facebook Live event that you're watching right now. So if you want to learn more about any of these organizations, you can just click right on their name, just right to by the screen. So I'm going to start this off, and we'll go to Cindy first and talk. Cindy will talk a little bit about the Dyslexia Coalition and how that came to be.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. The Dyslexia Coalition for Minnesota was it was both new and old. Old because we've known each other as partners for a long time, and we cooperate in many ways. But for the 2019 legislative session, we decided to more formally come together and work on specific legislation, bringing all of our resources to the effort and to really focus our constituencies and our efforts through a lobbyist to pass some legislation, which we will talk a little bit more about. So this was new this year, and we felt like we could each bring a different constituency to bear upon the legislators. So the Reading Center has our highly trained orton-gillingham tutors, and we have 70 years worth of families who have dyslexia in them. So lots of alumni, and Groves too has a large alumni base, as well as literacy experts. And of course, Decoding Dyslexia is just a rock star at organizing parents around advocacy for the dyslexic students. And last but not least, the International Dyslexia Association is such an important organization in terms of getting good information about dyslexia out to the public, providing that ongoing education, because people are newly diagnosed with dyslexia all the time, and they don't know where to go for reliable information. And so the International Dyslexia Association was also part of this partnership. So the dyslexia partners, when we came together, we had been observing with great interest the really important and successful work of Decoding Dyslexia over the last several legislative sessions. And we had always been cheering you all on, but not directly involved necessarily. So this was a way for us to just become more active and more supportive yet in that effort to help students with dyslexia across the state, no matter whether they were students who belonged to any of our organizations or not, because this really just widened it to all students in Minnesota.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. Let's shift to Rachel, who can tell us a little bit about the legislation that we worked on as a coalition this year and what happened in 2019. Good things. Good things
happened, for sure. Well, we were fortunate as a coalition to pass 2 pieces of policy that, again, are part of our 5-point mission. And we passed a screening bill, and we passed a higher education bill. And we couldn't have done that without, I truly believe that without the work of us coming together in a concerted effort as a coalition, and utilizing all of our constituents together, but also without the help of some very dedicated policymakers like Senator Chamberlain, Senator Clausen, Senator Nelson, Representative Heather Edelson, Representatives Kanish, Podine, and Joachim. So, I mean, this is a bipartisan issue, and definitely something that has raised a lot of awareness over the past 6 years and is gaining in awareness and momentum. And I think the reality is that there isn't a single person out there that isn't impacted somehow by dyslexia, whether it's somebody that you know, or somebody that you love, or a child of your own. I think when you talk to policymakers and educators, everyone can say, yeah, I know somebody who's impacted by that. So I think that we, really when we talk about policy and other things, we can agree that it makes good sense to ensure that children who struggle with dyslexia have access to lessons in literacy to meet their specific needs. I'm off track, Sarah. So
no, you're just fine.
And if you don't catch me, I'll go down a rabbit hole, and who knows where we're going to come out.
Let's have you talk a little bit about the intention of the legislation.
Sure.
What were we looking to do?
Sure. So frequently, people will hear me talk about something I call the 3 I's in policy, and that includes the intent of the law, the interpretation of the law, and then the implementation of the law. So with us and the policies that passed, the intent of the screening policy was simply to ensure that we are identifying children ahead of need and before it becomes a problem, so that the idea is to then match them to service. When we don't do that and we wait to identify them until, they're at an age in which maybe it's second or third grade, they've already lost those years of literacy development, and then they're behind. And sometimes that can mean a very expensive special education evaluation, and sometimes also a referral to special education, which then means more often than not, statistically, once you're referred into special education, you remain there for the rest of your academic career. So the idea with that policy is to ensure that we're identifying people early on and matching them to service, so that if they don't need to be in special education, they can receive their intervention or structured literacy and keep moving along accordingly. So that was the intent. And furthermore, the intent was when we introduced policy, it was that all children in the state of Minnesota would be between kindergarten and second grade would be screened. And right now our policy is that it's a little bit more nuanced in that not every child is going to be screened. We're left with something that's a little bit more subjective in my mind. And so the language of the law reads that it's children who are identified as struggling, and that to me can be an area of concern. I'm sorry, was I supposed to be there yet? No,
that's perfect. That's perfect. Let's bump to John, and we'll talk about screening specifically. So John, can you talk let's first of all because we could have a very diverse group of people that are listening. Let's define for a second dyslexia, and then if you can go into just some things about screening that people should know.
Sure. So there's a medical doctor by the name of Sally Shaywitz. She and her husband, Bennett Shaywitz, MDs, have studied dyslexia for much of their professional lives, involved with longitudinal studies of dyslexic children who became adults. And she ran the Haskins Laboratory at Yale University around reading and dyslexia. So I like her definition. It's a simple one. Dyslexia is an unexpected weakness in a sea of strengths. So we have our dyslexic students who cognitively are functioning at least average capacity, many of them very high capacity in terms of their intelligence and their potential, yet they struggle with language, with written language, with breaking the code of symbols and sounds. And the research that's fairly overwhelming that's out there, replicated in many different studies, is that the basis of dyslexia is not a visual acuity issue. It's not the reversals of B's and D's and P's and Q's and so forth, although there are dyslexic students who do that. All students do that developmentally, just some come out of it faster than others. But the root of dyslexia really is a phonological issue. And when we think of phonology, it's our sound system that we use. And quite simply, our brains aren't organized to learn to decipher written language in the way our brains are organized to learn oral language. So an infant moving into toddler, moving into school, learns language largely through exposure. It's thought anywhere from 18 to 50 different exposures of a word will then come into a child's lexicon, his oral vocabulary. Written language is not learned the same way. We've been speaking as a humankind for about 10,000 years, and we've used a writing system for about 5,000 years. So our brains haven't evolved to learn to decipher writing in the same way we have oral language. So there's a breakdown in a child's ability to break the code of symbol and sound. And a structured literacy approach is one that is appropriate for all students, but are necessary, absolutely necessary for dyslexic students. They need to have the underlying structures of the language brought to the surface and taught explicitly so that they can master those print concepts. So that, and when we think of dyslexia, we think of it on a continuum. That is, you can be minimally impacted on one end and significantly impacted on another. And we feel, Sally Shaywitz and Bennett Shaywitz feel that 1 of 5 individuals in the English-speaking world are dyslexic. So in a classroom of 20 students, that would be 4, right? I think 4 students that would have, would be on that continuum of dyslexia. And interestingly, generally, for most of the kids, we would treat it in a very similar way, just where they fall in the continuum, and the screening that we do would determine exactly what type of remediation, how intense that instruction is, how long that instruction may have to go on for to catch the student up. And we know the earlier that we can identify a student with dyslexia, the better the results are if we give them the proper forms of intervention. So screening or more complete assessments are really important to understand the nature of the problem and also to provide a path forward. I should also comment that there are many students in our schools today who are not reading at grade level and who are not dyslexic, but they're instructional casualties. They haven't been taught how to read correctly, and they get left behind too. So the structured literacy approach that we talk about that is absolutely critical for dyslexic kids benefits all students, those that will be instructional casualties, or those who are going to be overachievers as readers. If that structure of the language is brought forth to them earlier, they'll just read faster and more efficiently. So we know what good reading instruction looks like. We just have to be sure it's being done in our schools.
Okay, great. So this is either for Cindy or John. So I'm going to back up just a second. And for those that are maybe new to what it is that we're talking about related to screening, that the legislation that passed in 2019 means that starting in the 2020 school year, students who are not reading at grade level between kindergarten and 2nd grade must be screened for dyslexia, and students in 3rd grade and above must be screened for dyslexia if there is not another identifiable reason for that reading failure. So to a teacher or to a parent who's listening to this, what are let's just do it from a teacher perspective. If you're a teacher and you're looking at your classroom of 1st grade students, what are the kinds of things, the Minnesota Department of Education has great resources on its website. What screeners are useful for screening for dyslexia that are low cost or no cost, but sometimes the interpretation of that, is difficult if you're new to this. So either Cindy or John, if you're a 1st grade teacher and you're looking at your students, what are the things that you're looking for to determine whether or not one of your students is dyslexic or has signs of dyslexia?
So if we are generally saying, that somewhere between 10 and 20% of students do have this neurological condition called dyslexia. And again, it's not a function of intelligence, it's a function of brain organization. So if you know that 20% of your 20 or 25 students in your classroom are going to fall on this continuum somewhere, that's anywhere from 4 to 5 students that are going to be affected neurologically by this condition. So one of the most frustrating things for those of us who work with dyslexic students or teachers who teach them is this maxim or this adage that is often found in public education, and that it's a maturational thing, that Johnny will read when he's ready to read. The light bulb will go on when he's been surrounded by literature and been read to, and the brain will be ready to accept reading at that time. That's a really dangerous myth to believe in, because kids who struggle in a class of 25, those 4 or 5 kids who are struggling will continue to struggle, and the gap between them and their peers will just grow with time. without being properly identified and proper forms of intervention given. So I would say to any teacher of kindergarten, first, second, third grade, if you have students who are lagging their peers, and you have no reason to believe that it's a cognitive function and that they don't have the cognitive proficiency to learn to read, and that's a very, very, very small percentage of kids. I would go so far as to say that most classrooms do not have those students. Virtually all students can be taught to read. If you have students who are lagging, either with concepts of print, or we'll get into phonology in a minute, then they need a full assessment. We call it a psychoeducational assessment. So it's, in our view, my view, and I think those who are presenting today, much better to screen for a child and determine that he's not dyslexic than not to screen and let kids go unchecked or unidentified. So I think mandatory screening as early as kindergarten is really necessary. And what we also know is most schools benchmark kids 3 times a year in different assessments related to reading. And those benchmarks are normed tests. So we're measuring kids against their same age peers. So we know where kids fall in comparison to their peers. And if they're at the 20th percentile or lower, that's a red flag for me that there may be more going on here than just maturational issues.
Right, and I guess the only thing I would add is that since the schools are already doing screenings all of the time, that this way of asking them to do screening for students who are not proficient in their grade level gives the teachers some ideas to look at that screening with new eyes.
Yes.
To say, okay, here, and this guidance is on the MDE documentation of what are the things you're looking for. Those could be you've had a chat with the family and you know that there are reading issues in the family. It could be despite the direct instruction of it, there are some kids that are having difficulty really solidifying that sound symbol relationship. There are kids that are having difficulty with their sight words. There's all kinds of things that schools are already screening for, and this gives them an opportunity to look at it with new eyes.
Yep. And another one for parents too would be acquisition of oral language. So kids with dyslexia often are slower to develop their oral language lexicons. They're slow to talk. And it's just a warning sign. It's not necessarily if a student is slow to talk that he will be dyslexic, but it is an indicator.
Early speech and being flagged as a speech language, getting speech services is one of the things that, again, had I known then what I know now, it would have been a different outcome for us, because at age 2, my son was on an IEP for speech and treated through our district, but we didn't know that was an early warning sign.
One of the other really sort of commonsensical things too, in terms of whether a child might have a reading difficulty, is if school is good, if you go to a preschool or daycare or whatever, and then they matriculate into kindergarten and the letters come out, right, and they learn letter sounds. If all of a sudden the kid's affect changes about school when reading is brought into play, and they get stomach aches and they don't want to go to school, psychosomatics increases. Big time. And we see a lot of kids in kindergarten, first, second, third grade where K through 3 we're learning to read, and then in 4th grade we're reading to learn. Those kids, when letters and sounds are introduced and spelling, all of a sudden have lots of problems and don't want to go to school.
And it can really quickly, Cindy, I like what you said about looking at things through a fresh set of eyes, because really quickly in those early years, John, like you were saying, you can have different psychosomatic complaints and those can increase, but we can also start to look at things through a behavioral lens. And it looks like behavior as a cause, not behavior as a symptom of an unidentified unmet learning need, which is quite frequently the case. I mean, we look at these like it's an onion, and once you peel back the layers, the things that you can find out about how to best support children in their early literacy.
I think there's also some misconceptions out there in the public world, or even in the parent world. A lot of we hear a lot of schools or from parents that a lot of schools won't diagnose dyslexia, right? They don't feel qualified to do that. We've even had some parents tell us that a diagnosis of dyslexia has to be made by a medical doctor. And that is no more true than me diagnosing a medical condition that your child might have. I don't have the expertise and the background knowledge or the schooling to identify a disease or a medical issue with your child. A doctor doesn't have the training to be able to diagnose dyslexia either. You also hear in the schools that they won't diagnose dyslexia, but they do diagnose a specific learning disability in reading. Mm-hmm. Where dyslexia is actually in the fluency and the automatic recognition of individual words and connected text. So you're using very little mental energy in decoding the words and leaving enough mental energy to make meaning of what you're reading, which is the intent of reading, obviously. So whether it's called dyslexia or a specific learning disability or a specific learning impairment in reading, if it has to do with identifying a word, it is in fact dyslexia.
Mm-hmm. And that, I'll just say that's come up a little bit on the Facebook question and answers about diagnosing dyslexia and why don't schools use dyslexia. And I guess I'll just interject that dyslexia is now written several times in legislation and in statute in Minnesota. And this specifically does say you are screening for signs and symptoms of dyslexia. So we'll link to that legislation if you want to take a look at that. And if you're talking with a school district about what it is they should be looking for, the word is right there.
Yes.
So,
in fact, in October of 2016, the federal government, the Department of Education and the federal government sent a memo out to all schools in the country stating that dyslexia was a definable
and you can use it.
And it should be used. So that schools are actually not following federal policy.
That document is linked on Decoding Dyslexia Minnesota's website under resources.
Great. We'll stay on screening a little bit. And now that we've discussed screening, if a school does go through the screening process and does highlight a child who is likely dyslexic, what now? What happens now? And I think you all have a different bent on how to talk about that. But let's talk about Rachel first from the parent perspective. So your child's been screened for dyslexia, is likely dyslexic. What do you do with that information?
Well, that's a really good question because it depends on where someone is on that journey. And I'm going to guess that most people, if they're coming back with a positive screen, they're probably at the beginning step of that journey and really at a lack for resources and the how-to, what should they do? And so I think it's hard to know exactly because we don't know how schools are going to respond to this, but I would say, educating yourself on what your child needs in terms of structured literacy and what your district has to offer and where you're going to access those things is really important. With the coalition represented here today, there are a lot of great resources on everyone's websites and a lot of information on how to navigate things, including on the Department of Education's website with their Navigating Dyslexia paper that was created. And we're going to talk about resources at the end, but I think the most important thing I would say to parents is to learn to become an advocate for your student. I mean, learn to collaborate with the school on your child's needs. Certainly there's no need to come out guns a-blazing and it's not going to get you too far, but learning to effectively collaborate and talk about a personal learning plan and create that for the student.
Okay, great. That's a good place to start as a parent.
It's a start.
Another parent sort of action is also to stop blaming your child, because they're getting a lot of that, and they've probably gotten a lot of that, but because they were misunderstood, and there may be behaviors, and when they come home, when homework is just a nightmare, you need to just step back a minute and try to reorient yourself so that you look at what it is your child needs, be more encouraging, advocate for what they need, but to stop adding that attitude on that you're not trying hard enough.
That's really important. I'm glad you said that. And out of that will come how, again, a parent advocates, and there are accommodations and modifications, because if, as you said, if they're coming home and homework is just a nightmare because they've had everything they could do to survive that day, then therein lies something that probably needs to be considered for that child.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on both with what Rachel and Cindy said. Obviously don't blame your child, but also make sure your spouse is on the same page as well. Having worked with families with dyslexic children for 30 plus years, I'm painting with a broad brush, but it's fairly accurate. It's often that the moms have some kind of innate understanding that there's something wrong. And sometimes the dads, our responses, and I can say this because I'm a dad and I've done this, is lower your shoulder and work harder, that kind of attitude, without really understanding where the child's coming from in terms of his neurological brain organization. So it's really important that mom and dad are on the same page and supporting the child in the same way. And as Cindy said, don't blame your child, but also don't blame yourself. And as Rachel and Cindy both said, learn as much as you can about dyslexia so you are well informed going into your meetings with the school.
That's great. Now we've been talking a little bit, and you guys have peppered that in there, the concept of structured literacy. So when we say, what is it that a dyslexic student needs, let's talk a little bit about what structured literacy is. Defining that and getting that language out there, but also how that differs from what many students in Minnesota are receiving in their classrooms every day.
Start.
Sure.
That's a good one.
So structured literacy, the hallmarks of structured literacy would be instruction that is directly taught, that is sequential. It starts with the most basic parts of learning to read, those being the phonemes, the sounds, the sound letter connections, and then building it up. Not leaving it to a kid to just discover, because just putting a book in a kid's hands is not necessarily going to teach them to read, and it's definitely not going to teach a dyslexic student to read. So it's intensive, it is structured, it's sequential, it's systematic, and it's multisensory. That kind of reading instruction, which John mentioned, helps all kids learn to read, but it's essential for dyslexic students to read.
Yeah, and I totally, not surprisingly, total agreement with Cindy on what structured literacy is. And I would just add on that very few curricula, that is reading curricula that's out there for emerging or struggling readers, has an appropriate scope and sequence of skills that Cindy just mentioned, starting from the very most foundational, working up. Very few curricula have that, and unfortunately, most teachers coming out of colleges of education don't have the background knowledge to know what's missing or what's in the wrong sequence, what's good curriculum and what's bad curriculum. And That's why, again, going back to educating yourself about what good reading instruction is really important, because you're going to advocate for that at an IEP meeting for your child. And it's just not prevalent out there, the curriculum or the training of the teachers to use it.
I'll just interject that, we're not focusing on this conversation on the higher education provisions that were passed in 2019, but kind of speaking to that, that's a recognized issue, that teachers coming out of their teacher preparation classes did not spend a lot of time talking about dyslexia or the elements of structured literacy. So that's being addressed at the higher education level, but we're not going to delve too much into that. But maybe, John, you could talk a little bit about some of the school training partnerships that Groves is involved in, where you're going into, I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, so our partnerships, we're going in, so in the urban schools across this nation, we have a huge achievement gap between what, white middle class kids are doing in terms of their reading versus what urban youth are doing in their reading. So Groves Partnerships aims to go to have a partner school, public or charter, or even independent schools. We work with some Catholic schools as well. And we bring a literacy framework for all kids. So the literacy framework is good quality core instruction. So it's a good curriculum with teachers having the professional development needed to implement that curriculum. So it's ongoing, deep professional development. We're using data-based decision-making, so we're progress monitoring the kids on normed assessments, so we know how Johnny is doing compared to his same age peers. And if he's lagging behind, that's a sign for us that an intervention needs to happen. We're also using a multi-tiered system of support, the old RTI, response to intervention model, where if kids aren't responding in tier 1, whether they're dyslexic or whether they're just struggling readers, more environmentally, for environmental reasons, then they move into tier 2 and they get smaller group instruction, and they get what we call double dose, so they're getting extra minutes of reading instruction. It's those kids who, where you assume they're getting appropriate curriculum, appropriate instruction by trained teachers, two very big assumptions that often aren't met. But if they are getting that and not responding in tier 2, then that's a signal to us that a more thorough assessment needs to happen. So we would call that a psychoeducational evaluation, and then the kids can qualify for an IEP, for an individual education plan, based on a psychoeducational evaluation, which is a much deeper evaluation than a screen would be.
Can we, just for people who may not know all of the education speak that we talk about, so can you just define for people who are listening, when we say tier 1,
Tier 1 is
who are those kids?
So tier 1 are all the kids in a classroom. So say there are 25 students in a first grade classroom. Tier 1 instruction is instruction to all 25 students. Tier 2 instruction would be, of those 25 students, some are not responding fast enough to the instruction and they're falling behind. Those students move into tier 2 and they get additional instruction with, again, the assumption being a good curriculum by well-trained teachers, and that should catch 95% of those kids up. They may need to stay in tier 2 for a longer, so some will stay in for a longer amount of time, but 95% of kids should respond. The 5% who are left, 5 to 7 to 8%, would be your tier 3 or your special education students. And we can identify kids for an individual education plan, an IEP, in a couple of different ways. We can have a psychoeducational assessment to determine that, and there are certain criteria that need to be met. Or we could, a team meeting could be held to determine that that child is appropriate for an IEP because he's not responding to interventions already put in place.
Okay.
Can I
Yes.
just add a little something, and that is just, I'd like to point out that when we're talking about, when teachers are providing good reading instruction. I just want to say out loud that our teachers in the classroom have a very difficult job. They are doing their best by this large group of students. However, when they were being prepared to be teachers in college, they did not learn these things that would help them either understand dyslexia and how that interferes with learning to read, nor did they learn really this structured literacy. And that's not their fault for not learning that.
Thank you, Cindy. And I didn't mean, please don't interpret my comments as being demeaning to teachers. I think teachers are way undervalued in our society. And I've never met a teacher in the 30 plus years that I've been working with struggling readers who didn't want the very best for their students. But if you haven't been adequately prepared to teach reading or to teach a dyslexic student, you don't know what you don't know. And it's amazing when teachers go through a program like the Reading Center, their teacher training program, or Grove's training program, that invariably the teachers will say, wish we would have been given this knowledge in our schools of ed, but they just haven't been, and it's not their fault. And that's part of what the coalition is trying to do, is to put out what is good reading instruction for all kids. And absolutely essential for dyslexic kids.
So on that same point, if you're whether you're a parent but especially if you're a teacher out there listening, where would you recommend that teachers go to learn more about structured literacy and how they might bring that into their classrooms?
Well, there's 4 great organizations represented here in the Reading Center and in Decoding Dyslexia and the International Dyslexia Association Upper Midwest Branch and Groves. Also, about a year ago or so, the Minnesota Department of Education created a dyslexia specialist position within the department, and the woman who has filled that position, Amy Schulting, gave a webinar last week on structured literacy, among other things. And she's a great resource, and the department website would be a good resource as well.
Great. Anyone else want to touch on that? Okay. I'm going to go to Rachel here. Rachel's been quiet, so we're going to rope Rachel in.
So much other good conversation.
So we've talked about where good information is. How can parents and teachers, because there's a very broad coalition of people involved in trying to get more of these things in schools and available to kids. For parents or teachers who are listening, how can they get involved with Decoding Dyslexia?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. Generally, people engage us and become involved by following us on our Facebook page and asking for more, or how do we become more involved? One of the most important things, though, is when we are working on policy that benefits all kids in the state of Minnesota, is that we frequently need to know where people are at, who their policymaker is. And if we have people sign up on our website and go through the actual form, that's the way that they can become engaged with us, stay in the know and stay connected and know about all of the different things that are going on. So believe it or not, there's more than what just happens on Facebook. So usually signing up will send us a form, and in that they can kind of tell us how they'd like to be involved, whether that would be to volunteer, if they're interested in at some point becoming a board member, or if they'd like to have a group within their school district. That's something else that we do. We have district leaders, and so we have districts across the state, school districts, and people that have raised their hand in that specific area to kind of be the go-to in their group and be a resource and help kind of go to their school boards and others and talk to them about dyslexia as a whole. So.
Rachel, are there teachers who belong to Decoding Dyslexia?
Yeah. Actually, there's quite a few. And usually it is someone who has some level of knowledge on dyslexia themselves, whether it's they have found out they've had a child with it, or they are working with a kid within their classroom that has it, or as a literacy instructor, they've discovered dyslexia and really kind of taken a love of it and wanting to further their own education. But there are a great many of teachers that are involved. I would say that number is pretty high compared to what you would think it would be.
So there's a place in advocacy, dyslexia advocacy for teachers.
Absolutely. It's equally important for educators to be able to tell policymakers and others, whether it be their district administration or, just speak up about the need to ensure that everyone has equitable access to lessons in literacy to meet their needs, but definitely a place for them.
Yeah, I think getting teachers behind dyslexia and structured literacy is really important. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, we gave a presentation, an evening presentation on reading and struggling readers. And there were about 100 people in attendance. And unbeknownst to me, about 15 to 18 of them were teachers from a specific district where the presentation was being held. Based on that talk that night, those teachers went to the superintendent and said, we really need to have a structured literacy program in our district. And that district did embrace it. And now all of their K through 3 teachers are trained, their special education teachers are trained. But that impetus came from teachers and parents coming together, forming a coalition and working together to make change.
Fantastic.
It takes everyone.
Yes. In the time that we have left, I want to talk about how we're not a one and done coalition, that we know that there's still work to be done. So let's talk a little bit about starting in legislation in the 2020 legislative session, what that might look like and kind of what we're thinking. Rachel, do you want to start that?
Sure. We have the pieces this year that we're screening will roll out in fall of 2020. And we also have a higher education piece. So what's becoming, what we're becoming aware of, or what will come out of that as a necessity is the need to have professional development on the in-service educator level to some degree. So that they are, being given, I guess I always look at it as an equity piece. It's only, fair and equitable that our educators that are in service and in the field have equal opportunity to having instruction as well. So we can have higher education working with new and upcoming educators, but we need to make sure that, again, if we've got these screenings coming through and now we're identifying students, well, then we need to know what next for those students, and we need to ensure that we can offer instruction, intervention to meet those needs. And in order to do that, we have to have our educators prepared.
We have to absolutely agree. We have to have everybody on the same page. Teachers, the union, and administrators all have to be behind this.
And I think there's something really important to just kind of lay out there as well. Oftentimes people will assume, oh, when you mean professional development, you want all educators to become, teachers of orton-gillingham. That's not necessarily the truth. I mean, structured literacy works for all students, but our goal isn't to make every educator out there a practitioner of orton-gillingham. It's to ensure that within schools and districts, children who have a need for specific literacy instruction have access to that. Without having to go outside the district, because we know that not everybody can go outside the school and afford literacy instruction. So it isn't to turn every educator into a very specific practitioner. It's to ensure that once children are identified, there's a match to a service, and that service actually does exist. And if we can do this in that tier 2 place, then we can also reduce some of those referrals to special education that maybe aren't necessarily needed.
So I was involved in a project in California when I was running a school, and it was a 3-year project that was funded it was a literacy intervention program, identification and intervention program, starting in kindergarten, going through second grade. And the number of Title I referrals, which are reading support, reading help in the school, were reduced by 90% with this identification intervention program, which literally cost $60 per student per year. So you're talking about a very small investment for a very big return. And that's the kind of program that we would like to see schools develop, that where they're identifying kids very early, giving them proper forms of intervention, and then the return on that would be staying out of the special ed system or the Title I system and saving the schools lots of money in the process.
Right.
Not to mention saving kids' self-esteem and sense of worth.
Well, I mean, statistically, once they enter that special education, they will remain there the rest of their academic career.
They don't come out.
It impacts their ability to see a future for themselves, if that is college. And then the odds are stacked against them in college. Again, if you're a student with learning disabilities, the odds are that 60% of students with LD will drop out of college before they receive their four-year degree. So we are talking about a significant impact to the life of a student if we do not identify early and match them to service.
And take it one step further. We can make this analogous to healthcare, right? You can spend pennies on the dollar in healthcare for primary prevention. Same is true with reading. We estimate that 70% of the inmates in our penitentiary system don't read beyond a fourth grade level. How many of them are dyslexic or how many were just instructional casualties doesn't really matter. But if we could keep 10% of inmates out of prison at $40,000 plus a year to incarcerate, and not to mention the life that you're giving back to somebody, that's what it's all about. And we can do that if we, as a society, put our values in the right place.
That's great.
Amen.
Rachel, can I go back just a second to you, because I think you're the one that can talk about this the best, that in the last legislative session, there was a massive petition that went out to teachers and parents, asking them what they were, so as we talk about professional development, I think you know where I'm going with this. Is this something that, schools and parents and teachers, is this something that they want? What has been what's the response to that?
Right. So there was a petition that went out during the session, and we got 2,500 responses on these little cards where educators and parents filled out what they would, they want more professional development, specifically when it comes to dyslexia. So we can't say that people don't want it. It's there. And we also know that, in a survey put out pre-session in 2018, again, we've got this addressed. We have learned that in teacher prep programs, educators weren't getting it there, and they're not getting it in service. And so again, we've got educators and parents saying, we want this, we need this for the success of our students. And it was pretty overwhelming to see all of those printed out and stacked up neatly, and to actually thumb through some of them, because every single one of those is a person who cares.
Yeah. And the legislators did thumb through them. They read some of them.
Yeah, it is. It's every single one of those is a life and a person who cares.
Yeah, they told some really poignant stories.
It's pretty powerful when this legislative work has been done over the last few years to listen to students share their stories at hearings. It's really, it's powerful stuff. And that motivates all of us to work on your behalf out there for your children and for all children. So that's why joining something like Decoding Dyslexia or the International Dyslexia Association, getting on the Reading Center's mailing list or Grove's mailing list can be really helpful to you and energizing to us at the same time.
Absolutely. That's probably a great way to end it. I appreciate everyone who joined live and the others that will listen later on. So thanks to everyone for participating, and we'll see you all engaged in 2020.
I hope
right?
so. Yes.
Okay.
Engage with us.
Hi, Mom.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good evening.